absolutely we're suspicious. What did they know? What did they find? What did they discover? We need to, I want to know. I can't speak for everybody. But this video here is the real reason the USSR went to Venus and what they discovered. Let's see.
Take a look at this spacecraft. It bears a marked resemblance to the Apollo lunar module, the one from which Neil Armstrong took one giant leap for mankind. But what is this green seasonal paint? The truth is, this top-secret spacecraft has nothing to do with NASA. You're looking at the top-secret Luni Korabl, which allowed the USSR to draw dangerously close to the Americans in the space race. This spacecraft went to space 3 times, and its ultimate mission was not only to bring a cosmonaut to the moon, but also to lay the ground for a moon colony. The official story is that neither it nor Luni Korabl ever existed, but documents retrieved from classified archives after the fall of the USSR revealed no less than a covert space program. This video will bring you abandoned Soviet moon bases, eerie sounds recorded on Venus, and even lasers for an orbital war against the US.
I don't know about y'all, but anytime I hear about something, just to find out that it didn't exist is the statement released about it, that doesn't do nothing but make me more intrigued and curious to find out what they're trying to cover up. That's what it's doing.
Secret projects like this were the USSR's hope for winning the space race. How did it come so close to triumph? Archive data confirmed that the Soviet Union had every intention of colonizing another planet. In 1961, a sci-fi movie called Planet of Storms premiered in cinemas. It told the story of brave Soviet explorers who didn't merely land on this planet, but even swam in the ocean there. It was completely in line with the scientific knowledge of Earth's closest neighbor at the time. After all that the 20th century astronomers could discern on Venus was a thick veil of carbon dioxide, they assumed it was hiding vast warm oceans similar to soda water. But while cinemagoers were applauding the sci-fi picture, they couldn't even imagine it was no longer fiction. By that time, the USSR had launched 2 covert flights to Venus. The first one took place on February the 4th, 1961, and carried the first ever probe for a thorough study of Venus. But its engine shut down unexpectedly, and the spacecraft never flew higher than low Earth orbit. Hesitant about acknowledging the failure, Soviet officials claimed that they were testing some heavy satellite. Luckily, the second launch, which followed in a week, was a success, and it was declared to be humankind's first mission to Venus. The Venera 1 interplanetary probe flew close to Earth's neighbor in May of that same year, but didn't transmit any data because its antennas were overheated. At least, that's what the official version said. In 1965, the Venera 2 probe suffered the same fate, but its twin, Venera 3, safely reached Venus and became the first ever spacecraft to enter the atmosphere of another planet. But the infinitely precious measurements were lost again because of overheating. But even despite these setbacks, Soviet officials continued the program, harboring hopes to find a world to colonize where the USSR's red flag would look especially good. The Venera 4 probe reached Venus in October of 1967. Its heat-resistant space capsule contained all the equipment required to study the composition and conditions of Venus's atmosphere. This time, according to official reports, the capsule successfully sent lots of useful information to Earth, except when it came to what Venera 4 saw. The USSR was silent as the dead about it. Luckily, that whole time, the probe was in the crosshairs of NASA's first Venusian probe, Mariner 5. American engineers saw that the atmospheric entry never happened, with the capsule burning up instantly in the upper layers of the atmosphere instead. This made it possible to determine that carbon dioxide made up not just Venus's observable clouds. As it turned out, the planet's entire atmosphere was 97% carbon dioxide. Moreover, calculations showed that the pressure on the planet's surface had to be dozens of times higher than on Earth. Soviet scientists must have obtained the same data, so newer spacecraft, Venera 5 and Venera 6, were equipped with sturdy but light capsules made of magnesium-aluminum alloy with braking parachutes. This time, Soviet engineers expected the probe to not just enter the atmosphere, but explore the surface of Venus. But when they received the first data from the capsules in May of 1969, they suspected another failure at first. The equipment seemed to have gone mad. Almost an hour after it entered the atmosphere, it reported the outside temperature at 320 degrees Celsius and the pressure at 26 Earth atmospheres. Combined with sulfuric acid clouds, these hellish conditions burned out the insides of both capsules when they were as high as 20 kilometers above ground. But because both probes sent the same incredible measurements, there could have been no mistake. Venus turned out to be no tropical heaven. It was a real acidic hell. And although the furtive dreams of Soviet colonies on Venus were shattered, reaching the planet's surface was a point of honor and hence the #1 task of the Venera program. But it required time, and the USSR needed any win in the space race as soon as possible. Intending to land a final blow to America's reputation in the space race, the USSR embarked on a mission to set up an outpost on the moon. In the early 60s, the U.S. was falling behind noticeably. Just a couple of years after the remarkable success of Earth's first satellite, Soviet engineers managed to deliver the Luna 2 probe to the moon in September of 1959. Actually, it was their 6th attempt. The first 5 that failed were kept secret. In the early 60s, Soviet officials made it very clear that they were going to send crewed missions to the moon and even start a permanent colony there. The U.S. Department of Defense immediately began to develop the top-secret Project Horizon.
I ain't gonna lie, hearing how many attempts happen when they're attempting to either go to Venus or to the moon or do different things kind of makes me respect Elon even more, bro, of the determination and consistency and the drive and the passion and everything that he's doing to get us to one day colonize either Mars or I don't think I really heard him talk about the moon, but I could have missed that. But just hearing this constantly with any mission, the multiple times it takes to either get any type of probe or spacecraft or rover or something there, it takes multiple attempts. So that just makes me grow even more respect for bro.
Focused on constructing a military lunar base. Convinced of the Soviet Union's upper hand in the race, American experts rushed into the decision to deliver nothing more than several cylindric containers to the moon. By December of 1966, they were to become a home for a garrison of 12 American soldiers. All it would take was 150 launches of the yet-to-be-developed Saturn I rockets and $6 billion in spending. Not to mention that most of the solutions to maintain such a base weren't even invented yet. The task was entrusted to engineers from the newly formed NASA. It was they who realized that Project Horizon had no practical point. As early as September 1962, President John Kennedy publicly announced a more modest and achievable goal of sending a human to the moon by the end of the decade. If only NASA knew that despite their claims, the USSR hadn't even started their lunar program yet. In the early 60s, Sergei Korolev's design bureau focused solely on designing a new super heavy lift rocket, the N-1, which was the main thing that offered hope for crewed moon missions. While satellites and Venera probes were launched on the Molniya rocket, which had a carrying capacity of just 2 tons, the N-1 would make it possible to deliver deliver up to 23.5 tons of payload. That is 12 times as much. Kennedy's announcement clearly spurred on the USSR, so the authorities ordered Korolev, who hadn't even finished the new rocket, to plan the first Soviet lunar mission. The vehicles involved in it were indeed surprisingly similar to Apollo's, except they were 3 times smaller and lighter, only allowing one person to land on the moon instead of 2. The Soviet lunar module even copied the American vehicle in how it was to lift off from the lunar surface. The Soviet authorities were eager to pull it off as early as December of 1967, but its success would have only been an intro to the actual Soviet triumph in the space race. Up to his neck with work, Korolev was spared, and full-fledged lunar-based development was assigned to the KBOM Design Bureau led by Vladimir Barman. Unlike the U.S. military, he already had information about radiation on the moon at hand and reasoned that a crew would not survive in the modules scattered on the surface. Soviet engineers calculated that it would be optimal to cover living compartments with a thin layer of lunar soil. It would protect them not only from radiation, but from meteors too. Their solution was truly groundbreaking. Even now, some Martian-based designers plan to use the same trick. Building on their calculations, Barman's team also intended the lunar soil to be used in greenhouses, just like in the movie The Martian. Cosmonauts would have cooked the vegetables grown there in a special kitchen compartment and then gone to the gym to keep fit. Drinking water was supposed to be obtained chemically in the lab compartment. Outside on the lunar surface itself, they only intended to place a nuclear reactor, a solar power station, an observatory, and a garage for moon rovers. In honor of the chief designer, the Soviet base was nicknamed Barmangrad, meaning Barman's town. If it had ever welcomed any citizens, there would have been 4 to 12 people. The delivery of all people and cargo was to be ensured by 3 years of regular launches of the new N-1 rocket. After 7 years of development in 1969, Barman's draft finally made its way to the table of the Soviet leadership in the top-secret folder. The thing is, the timing couldn't have been worse. Against all expectations, in July of the same year, the first people went to the moon as part of the U.S. Apollo mission. Meanwhile, the Soviet lunar program stalled due to Sergei Korolev's death, and his engineers were only beginning to test the long-awaited super heavy-lift N-1 rocket. After such a kick in the teeth, the Soviet Union desperately needed new wins. And even though they didn't abandon their moon exploration plans, they decided to focus on extending their lead where the U.S. was weaker, that is, in the interplanetary race. Soviet engineers were tasked with exploring Venus and obtaining first-ever records from the surface of another world at all costs. So, as early as August the 17th, 1970, the USSR launched the Venera 7 mission, which was classified just like its predecessors and was very unlike them in everything else. Its orbital module was cleared of almost all equipment to protect the capsule from Venus's hellish climate. This time, it was made of titanium and ceramics, with designers expecting the pressure of 180 atmospheres, which is what an underwater vessel is subjected to on Earth when it reaches a depth of around 2 kilometers. The capsule's thick shell protected only a few critical detectors and a heavy-duty acrylic glass fiber parachute that could withstand a temperature of up to 530 degrees Celsius. But even with such elaborate precautions, Soviet engineers weren't sure if the vehicle would win the battle with the infernal planet. On December the 15th, 1970, the capsule entered the atmosphere. As soon as it did, things fell flat. Its heat-proof parachute melted, so the titanium blank hurtled down from tens of kilometers above ground. The engineers braced themselves for yet another classified failure. After all, no probe would have survived such a crash if it happened on Earth. But oh, the irony. On Venus, the landing was softened by the hellishly thick atmosphere. atmosphere. The capsule of Venera 7 crashed into the planet's surface at a speed of only 60 kilometers per hour. It was basically an unremarkable traffic accident. The capsule became the first terrestrial vehicle to send data from another planet's surface and continued to do so for an entire 23 minutes. But even despite the mission's success, the Soviet Union kept its results under wraps for a whole month. It wasn't until January of 1971 that the world learned Venus's surface had a pressure of 90 atmospheres and a temperature of 475 degrees Celsius. It's as hot as the inside of an industrial furnace. But the next secret Soviet mission, Venera 8, which took place on July the 22nd, 1972, showed that the Venusian furnace had enough light to take a photo. Moreover, the probe discovered a light wind on the planet's surface, the sound of which could be recorded. Soviet engineers entered a desperate race with time as NASA declared its intentions to send the Viking missions to Mars in order to take first-ever photos of another planet. In the summer of 1975, almost simultaneously with the launch of Viking 1, two Soviet interplanetary ships, Venera 9 and Venera 10, set out for Venus. Their capsules had been redesigned. Since none of the parachutes had survived the hellish entry before, they were equipped with special shock-absorbing struts for when they would hit the surface. Designers also added a liquid cooling system for the equipment and camera. Lens caps were only supposed to open upon successful landing. Eventually, the capsules entered Venus's atmosphere 3 days apart and safely reached the surface. But their main lens caps never opened. However, the spare ones worked perfectly well. On October the 22nd, 1975, Venera 9 sent this black and white and very blurry panorama of piles of cobblestones under the capsule. This became the first ever picture of another planet's surface. On October the 25th, Venera 10 sent back a panoramic shot of its rocky landing site with the struts clearly visible. The USSR won the interplanetary photo race by a landslide, as the American Viking 1 sent the first photos of Mars only in the summer of 1976. But Soviet engineers didn't stop there. They just had to add insult to NASA's injury. It took them a whopping 7 years and a series of not-so-successful attempts, but in March of 1982, Venera 13 and Venera 14 capsules sent back the first and only panoramas of Venus' surface in color. Those came with a sound recording to ensure full immersion into this eerie acid yellow landscape. Listen carefully. This is what hell sounds like.
Sound like a torch, bro. It sounds like somebody just holding a torch, possibly at you if you were there on that planet, and you just withstanding a torch. Sheesh.
The rumble you've just heard could have been a distant thunder in sulfuric acid clouds. Almost half a century had passed since that very moment when the last two Soviet capsules underwent terrible heat and pressure, and no other spacecraft had recorded anything similar on Venus yet. But anyway, this incredibly successful Venera program was conceived rather as an addition to the main achievement, defeating the United States in the space race near Earth. What happened to the Soviet lunar base then? Declassified documents have revealed incredible facts about the abandoned base Zvezda and the USSR space weapons. In 1982, the same year when the Venera capsules sent color photos and audio recordings to Earth, the Soviet Luny Korabl lands on the moon in complete secrecy. It carries no people yet. It opens its doors to release a 3-ton moon rover, which drives out onto the surface and lowers a mysterious cylinder measuring 3.6 by 6 meters. It also has wheels and soon drives away from the landing site. The cylinder finds a spot where the lunar soil is the most yieldable and starts spinning. Its surface, with spiral blades, turns it into one giant horizontal drill. This miracle of Soviet engineering is nothing but a unique self-digging habitat. After 4.5 hours of drilling, it stops a couple of meters into the ground and is now ready made to lodge 3 people. They arrive on the moon a few months later. By 1985, the Soviet lunar base Zvezda comprised as many as 9 modules with all the necessities, just like Barman planned: solar panels, a nuclear reactor, water and oxygen generators, and science labs. The base crew of 6 goes on rotation once a year. But within a few years, the Soviet base Zvezda, with a total weight of 130 tons and a cost of $80 billion, is destined to become the most expensive abandoned facility in the history of humankind. You see, while the design of the lunar base is a success, the Soviet Union has enormous problems with the key element of the entire program, without which it cannot exist. Since 1969, the N-1 super heavy lift rocket was tested 4 times, and every single test ended in a catastrophe. Poorly designed filling pipes caused fuel to spill right onto the red-hot first stage at the very start, triggering a powerful explosion. Naturally, these failures were kept under wraps, and all the attempts to fix N-1 failed. It all ended with the new chief designer of the space program, Valentin Glushko, closing the N-1 project in 1974. In its place, engineers started developing a new super heavy lift launch vehicle. Vulcan could carry almost twice as much weight as N-1. The Vulcan rocket could deliver 43 tons of payload to the moon at once. This meant that only 4 launches would be needed as part of the Zvezda base construction. According to official data, only 2 of those took place and had completely different tasks. Declassified documents only mention the Zvezda lunar base project. But what if its implementation turned out to be such a failure that it was covered up with extreme thoroughness? What if the thwarted rocket launches left Zvezda's inhabitants without sustenance, turning it into the first space tomb in history, several feet under a thick layer of lunar soil? It might well be true, given that the USSR managed to develop a weapon for space wars with the United States, and the data about it hasn't been fully declassified yet. Back in the early 70s, the Soviet Union set another record in the space race, launching the first ever space stations. They were known as Salyut to the public, and their official purpose was peaceful scientific research. But classified documents referred to them as Almaz military stations used to study the possibility of orbital warfare. The program reached its high point in July of 1974 with the launch of the Salyut 3 station, which had a unique identifier in the Almaz program and carried a special top-secret cargo on board. It was a 14.5mm gun. It shared the caliber with some sniper rifles used to destroy light utility vehicles. Except this monster was a space machine gun that could fire up to 5,000 rounds a minute, and unclassified data suggests that on January the 24th, 1975, the space gun went off. It fired a total of 20 rounds at a target satellite, but what happened to the ill-fated victim is still being kept under wraps. The only thing we know is that the test itself was carried out remotely, in absence of the station's crew, and a few hours before it fell into Earth's atmosphere. However, given the USSR's love for covering up failures, it's quite likely that things didn't go smoothly. The super space-based weapon might have been deemed impractical because aiming it would involve heaving the entire station, and the recoil could change its trajectory. What also speaks for this version of events is that soon after testing the gun, Soviet engineers started working on a much more mobile weapon that could fit in the hand of a cosmonaut at the Almaz military station. This is a real prototype of a laser handgun for destroying enemy satellites. According to partially declassified data, it was completed by 1984. It could even be fired without spacewalking. The laser passed through the illuminator glass and was supposedly capable of blinding the sensitive optical.
That's crazy. If you have a laser that could go through the glass where you ain't even got to go out of the craft that you're in into space and shoot it, you can do it from right there and it goes through it. That's insane to have, bro. No way. No way. No way. Y'all gonna have to show me that one.
systems of American spacecraft. However, the Soviet miracle gun never reached orbit. This project, like all the others, fell victim to the USSR's deep crisis. The superpower simply overextended itself in the space race. NASA plans to return people to the moon as part of Project Artemis no later than 2030. New missions to Venus are scheduled around the same time, give or take. And here's what bothers me. What if, somewhere among the cold lunar views and hellish Venusian landscapes, astronauts and probes stumble upon what was left after the most secret of the USSR's failures? What or whom will we meet there after 50 years?
Listen, one more thing before we end the video, right? Check this out, right? China sends the youngest ever astronauts to space.
Now, China has successfully launched its youngest ever astronauts, or taikonauts, into space, where they'll spend the next 6 months on a station called Heavenly Palace. Beijing is aiming for a record year of lunar exploration, but the US is growing increasingly alarmed at the prospect of a new space race. Laura Bicker reports.
This launch is yet another step in a growing space race, a battle which could even decide who owns the moon.
We were so close, you could feel the ground vibrate, and the fact that China feels so confident to have us here shows its own confidence in its growing space ambitions. This is one of 100 launches they're planning this year as they try to rival the United States.
These are the 3 chosen to fly to China's homegrown space station. They've been in quarantine and are kept away from us behind glass. They include the country's first female space engineer.
I dream of exploring the vastness of space, waving to the stars, and of course, looking back at my homeland. My deepest affection will always be for my motherland, no matter where I am. I will keep striving and working tirelessly.
The team have trained together for a year to conduct experiments and carry out spacewalks. The pilot is a veteran, but both Wang and her crewmate are China's next generation of space explorers. This year they watched their country carry out an historic first and collect lunar samples from the far side of the moon. China also has a fleet of satellites in space and plans for many more, a rival to Elon Musk's Starlink. The modern space race is no longer about getting to the moon. It's about who'll control its rich resources, valuable minerals and metals, and the head of NASA is worried China will claim them.
I keep telling y'all that's what it's about, bro. And I feel like each planet has its own distinct mineral or whatever of value that it has. And that's why they've ramped up this space race, bro. They're after something.
I think his concerns are unnecessary. We adhere to the principles of peaceful use, equality, mutual benefit, and joint development.
As the astronauts make their last steps on Earth for the next 6 months, they're waved off as national heroes. China's rivalry with the US is no longer just based here on Earth. Both could soon be staking territorial claims well beyond this planet. Laura Bicker, BBC News, Gansu.